Hello everybody. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to replace your brake rotors, brake pads, and emergency parking brake components. And I'm going to be demonstrating this on my 2002 Acura TL-S. I'm also going to be showing you how to properly lubricate your braking system so you too can have brakes that last as long as mine. My front brakes up there currently have about 78,000 miles on them, and based on the pad life, as I'll show you really soon, I would have to guess that they have at least a year or two left in them. And then my rear brakes currently have 88,000 miles on them. And on the rear passenger side, the brake pads have worn down pretty much to the metal, so it's definitely time to replace those. You'll also see later in the video that my emergency parking brake components are pretty badly rusted, and so I decided that it's also time to replace that. Now, working on the front and rear brakes are going to be exactly the same almost, except for two main differences. The rear brakes have an e-brake inside, and there's a little adjuster you have to tighten and loosen in order to get the rotor off. And the other difference is that there are different size bolts for the front and rears, and therefore different torque specs. When it is time to replace your brakes, you only need to replace them in pairs, either both of the rears or both of the fronts. You don't necessarily have to change all four at the same time, because my fronts probably still have another 10 or 20,000 miles left on them. I could go a whole year or two without having to change them. So for now, I just need to replace the rears. But when you do replace your brakes, you do need to replace both rotors and all the pads on each side. So let's go over some symptoms that might indicate that it's time to replace your brakes. The first one could be a warped rotor, which is caused usually by excessive heating and cooling of the rotors. And you can tell if you have a warped rotor usually by the car shaking really aggressively every time you brake. One way to indicate if it's a front or rear rotor that is warped is if the steering wheel shakes or not. So if the car is shaking and the steering wheel is shaking as you're braking, it's a front rotor. If just the car is shaking and not the steering wheel, it's a rear rotor that is warped. Sometimes your brakes might also make a loud squeaking sound, and that's usually because of this metal piece right here. This is a wear indicator. And specifically when your pad wears down enough and you hit the brakes, this little piece of metal will scrape against your rotor and make a really loud, annoying squeaking sound, which indicates that your pad life is low and it's time for them to be changed. It would also be a good idea to do a visual inspection maybe once or twice a year. Sometimes the pads won't wear evenly, and therefore that wear indicator might not be able to do its job in determining if the pads need to be replaced. You can see on this outside pad that there's maybe a 0.5 millimeter of pad life left, and that other one in the back has a little bit more life, and that indicator isn't able to squeak and let me know that the pad life is low. So that's why sometimes you should do a visual inspection, and as you can see, it's definitely time to replace this one. It's probably even worn down to the metal a little bit, which would indicate why there's this scarring going on around on the rotor. That's another visual inspection you can look for. And even right here, you can see there are actually a couple little chips in the rotor. So that's definitely not good, and we're gonna be replacing these. Next, we're gonna need some parts. I'm replacing just the rear wheels, brakes, so I'm gonna need 2 rotors and 4 pads. We're also gonna need some brake clean because when these rotors get shipped out, they're protected by an oily film so they don't get rusty. So we need some brake clean to clean off that oily film. And then there are a couple different types of lubricants that you could potentially buy. I like to use the silicone separately because it's really good for those caliper slide pins and specifically those rubber boots. You don't want to use a ceramic lube on any rubber components because it can cause them to swell, crack, dry out, and just basically ruin them. So you'll definitely, at least at minimum, want a silicone paste. This here is a ceramic paste. This is good for moving metal on metal parts. So specifically, you can put the lubricant on the edge of these pads here, which slide into the retainer. And every time you brake, it squeezes the pads, and when you let off the brakes, they kind of back off. So these pads, even though they don't move much, they are nonetheless moving. And then you could use anti-seize, but the thing about anti-seize is this is for non-moving metal on metal parts. So if you use anti-seize on your pads, you're gonna wanna make sure that you at least replenish the anti-seize every now and then. Otherwise, I like to use the anti-seize on the caliper bolts because I work on my brakes pretty frequently, just relubricating everything, and it makes removing those bolts really easy to remove since I live in the Rust Belt. If you don't want to get separate lubricants, you could get something like Silglide, which is an all-in-one silicone-based lubricant. Silicone-based is mainly the main thing you want to look for in a lubricant because it'll be compatible with those rubber boots, as well as it can also be used on any other brake component, including the edge of these pads here. I'll put a link in the description for everything used in this video. So now we're going to be buying some parts. I personally like to buy these centric rotors. They are very cheap, they last a long time, and they also have this nice black rust-resistant protective coating on all surfaces of the rotor, except for the area where the brake pads come in contact with. And then I usually don't recommend aftermarket parts, but these cheaper Duralast parking brake hardware kit and parking brake shoes, these work just fine, they fit wonderfully, and I have no complaints, and they have a lifetime warranty. And then lastly, I recommend the Bono Pro Ultra Premium ceramic pads. These also, again, are pretty affordable. They last a very long time. They are ultra quiet. They do not make a peep at all, and they don't require any break-in period or bedding. More on that later, though. So first, let's find our parts. There are a lot of different parts out there and a lot of different websites you can get these parts from, but when you go to these different websites, their part catalogs aren't always accurate, such as on Amazon. You'll see a lot of reviews saying, "This didn't fit my car," when that's because their part catalog is wrong. So I always recommend going to the manufacturer directly on their website and getting the part number from there, and then copying and pasting it onto whatever website you want to buy the part from. So here's my 2002 Acura TL braking system. Find products. Then I'm just going to filter my results down a little bit so I can find just the rotor. And here we go. I get just the basic, cheaper premium discs. Here's your part number for the fronts, and I'm specifically going to be replacing the rears. There's our part number for the rear. And here we are, $20 per rotor, and they lasted me 88,000 miles. How can you complain with that? You really can't. Going to come back, and now we're going to come to AutoZone and pick up our parking brakes. Again, you want to type in your vehicle. I've already got it entered. 2002 Acura TL. Parking brake. And then here's the parking brake hardware kit. $20. Comes with all the different little pins, springs, tensioners, the horseshoe clips, the adjuster. Also comes with this little packet of white lithium grease. I wouldn't recommend using that. I would use a dedicated ceramic lubricant. And then we're also going to pick up some parking brake shoes. Just going to get the basic ones, not the performance ones. And again, $22. Comes with all 4 pads for both sides, and all this equipment worked wonderfully. It fit fine, it was affordable, and I have no complaints. Also comes with a lifetime warranty. And lastly, we're going to find our Bono pads. So again, 2002 Acura TL. I am replacing the rears on my car. Here are the Pro Act Ultra Premium pads, and you can either get just the pads, or you can get them with the stainless steel retentioners. I've more than likely got the original ones that came with this car 20 years ago, and they're still working perfectly fine. So I don't think it's necessary to buy new ones. You can if you want. But here are the part numbers, ACT 536. And here are the pads. They're a little pricey on here. You can try that. Let's also look on eBay. And yeah, we can get them for $40 here from Pep Boys. And that seems like a pretty good deal, plus $5 shipping. Still pretty cheap. Just search around on different websites, Amazon. I know some people like that Rock Auto website, eBay. And you can save a couple bucks if you do a little bit of research. So the first thing we need to do is put some chucks under a wheel that we're not working on. Then we're going to jack up the corner of the vehicle that we do want to work on, put a jack stand in place, and remove the wheel. And then we're going to come over to this brake caliper here, and we're going to remove 2 caliper bolts. There's one right there, and there's one right there. So why don't we remove this first one. There we go, not too bad. There we go. And I was able to do that with one hand, and you can see that's why I like to put that anti-seize on there, because it made it so much easier. Next, we got to remove the caliper itself. Now, assuming that everything on your caliper is properly lubricated, it shouldn't be hard to remove. So there's a piston in the back here that we need to decompress, and we can simply do that by just grabbing onto the back of the caliper and giving it a pull. Just kind of pull towards yourself a good couple times, and that should decompress it, and off it comes, nice and easy. And you don't want to rest the caliper without supporting it on something, so I've just got this spare jack stand right here. I'm just going to set it on that, nice and simple. Next, we're going to remove our pads. So there's one on the outside. Let's take a look at this one. Yeah, there's no pad life left, and you can see it had worn down to the metal a little bit on the back there. Whoops, but that's okay. And then you also got the back one here. See, there's our wear indicator, and it was getting close, but not quite. But nonetheless, also very low on pad life, and it's time to replace it. Next, we have to remove this bracket, and this is held in, again, simply by 2 bolts. One right there, and one right there. Those are a 14 millimeter. We can now work towards removing the rotor. And the first thing you'll need to do, if they're still on yours, is remove the 2 screws that would be located right here. These are normally put on by the factory just to help secure the rotor to the vehicle during line production. And other times, people just like to put them back on as their own personal preference. I do not like to put them back on because I live in the Rust Belt, and they would otherwise become extremely rusted and difficult to remove. So if they are still on your vehicle, first thing I would recommend doing is spraying them with some oil penetrant, such as liquid wrench, to help ease the process in removing them. And if you have one, you could also take an impact screwdriver. I do not own one, but basically what you do is put it on the screw, smack the end with the hammer here, and it would turn it a corner turn. And that would reduce the chances of stripping the head of the bolt and also make it a lot easier to remove. Next, we gotta work towards loosening the parking brake, and we have to get behind this little rubber grommet here. I've just got my little pick tool. We're gonna kind of pry back behind there and pop that out. Next, we're gonna look inside that hole, and you'll see a spring, and then right behind that are a bunch of gear-like teeth. And what we need to do is take a flathead screwdriver right here, focus, and we need to put it in here and push down on those teeth. And that's going to loosen our parking brake to ensure the easiest possible removal of this rotor. And we're gonna keep pushing down on it until we can't push down no more, just to ensure that we've backed off those e-brake pads as much as possible. If for whatever reason the polarity of that adjuster is flipped, you'll know because you won't be able to turn your rotor anymore. So we're just gonna back that off, and then we'll work towards removing the rotor. One way you could do it is by trying to hammer it off. However, that's usually not the most effective method and very difficult. So instead what we're doing is we're gonna take these M8 by 1.25 threaded bolts, and these are 40 millimeters long. You can get these from Home Depot, and I'll post a link in the description. But we're gonna put them in these 2 threaded holes right here and right here. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna push against the face of the hub and force this rotor off with ease. Now sometimes these come off easy and sometimes it's hard, but we'll give it a try. And so what we wanna do is we wanna alternate these screws, probably a good half a turn to a full turn on each side, just to ensure that we're tightening them evenly. And sometimes this rotor, as you can see, will want to spin due to the rotational force. I think it's already loose. You can see it coming undone already. So, yep, it's already loose. So we can try working that off the rest of the way, or otherwise what we can do is we can continue to tighten these screws, and that'll help us work it the rest of the way out. So after removing the rotor, you might want to inspect your parking brake. As you can see on mine, it's getting pretty rusty and just in general very deteriorated. And you might want to consider possibly replacing yours as well. And so we're going to be going over how to replace your parking brake next before we put on the new rotor and pads. So first, located on each side is this little retainer clip pin. So we're going to take a needle nose pliers and we're just going to push in on the spring and twist this little pin at the same time. There we go. And then we're just going to pull that pin out the back of the brake assembly and remove this spring. Next, located on top are these two springs, one on each side. And so I'm just going to take my needle nose pliers again, and we're going to take off this spring. Try to. There we go. They're pretty strong. So we're going to undo both of those springs. With those springs removed, your parking brake is probably going to be a little bit connected right there. You can just kind of take a flathead screwdriver and kind of pry it apart, and then your parking brake should come apart like so. Here we go. And then there's a spring down here that we're going to remove. There we go, everything's starting to come together. So yeah, we're gonna remove this spring and this adjuster assembly next. And you can do that simply by kind of hyperextending the brakes, and then your adjuster should come off like that. And then by hand, you should be able to remove that little spring next. Next, we're gonna remove this metal piece right here that's connected by this spring. And remember the orientation, this little curved part goes up. And so you can just kind of simply twist that off and off it comes. To make the last step in removing this little horseshoe clip easier, we're going to remove the entire parking brake from the parking brake cable. It's easier with two hands, but you'll essentially just kind of push back on the spring while holding this little pin here with the other hand, and then off it'll come like that. So for this last part in removing this horseshoe clip, I like to orient it so the open part of the clip is located towards the back here. And then I'll take my big flathead screwdriver and I'll kind of pry it out and work it out like that. There we go, and it's out. Next, with everything removed, we're just going to take a quick wire brush and kind of remove any rust that we can, and then we're going to take our brake clean and spray down and clean this inside area. As you're taking everything apart, I might recommend putting it in the order that it was taken off. The only thing that we're probably going to be reusing is this metal plate right here. But otherwise, yeah, reverse order process. Let's get started with that. So first, we're just going to connect our new little spring here. Next, we're going to take our ceramic paste, since it's a metal on metal contact point, and we're going to lubricate this little joint. The cable connecting piece goes on the opposite side of the spring, and we'll push the pin in through the spring side, and then we'll put our washer on top, and then we're going to take our little horseshoe clip and put that on last. You can just start it by hand, and then you can take a hammer or something and just tap it on the rest of the way. You could also take a pliers and just kind of squeeze it on the rest of the way too. Next, we'll reattach that parking brake cable, and we're going to put this piece back on. Remember, the curved part is facing up, this little spring part is facing up, and first we're just going to put the other end of this spring on in that hole, and then we're going to put the piece back on like that. Before we put our adjuster back on, we're just going to take some brake grease and lubricate both the threads and this little part over here to ensure that in the future it'll continue to rotate smoothly. Next, we're going to attach the other brake shoe to this green spring down here, and then we're going to put that adjuster back on. And regardless of which side of the vehicle you're working on, you want to orient it so the threads are facing your right. So that way, when you rotate the teeth in a downward motion, it's going to turn this screw in and therefore decompress the brakes. So it's going to be the same orientation on both sides. And then we can just put it on in place there. We can hyperextend this brake a little bit like that, and then that'll give us room to put the adjuster back in. It's also while we're at the stage that we're going to take these little springs and we're going to put them on in the little holes of the brake shoes, so that way they will connect to this part right here. And then after that, we got to come up on top and reattach those springs to this center holding piece. So what we have to do now is we got to take this little pin here. You'll notice there's a little notch on the left side there. That's going to maneuver around the cable tensioner part. It's going to go in through that little hole right there. You'll see we got our 2 springs there, and then we got the 3rd hole down there. You're going to guide it in through the back right there. Eventually you will have gotten it to this point. We guided it so the big circle went over the pin and was sitting in a horizontal position, and then we took our needle nose pliers, we pushed in and we turned our key. But however, this is not the natural resting position we want it to end in. You can see the key is vertical like this. We want it to be horizontal like that. I'm just gonna take my screwdriver, I'm just gonna kind of tap it down. And there we have it. We have our new parking brake in place, all brand new and not rusty. Good job, everybody. Now we can move on to putting the rotor and the new brake pads in. Next, before we put the new rotor back on, we're gonna take some Brakleen and we're gonna spray down this rotor, get all that protective factory oil off. And then we're just gonna wipe it down with a paper towel. We're also gonna clean off the surface of this wheel bearing hub assembly here. And then we're gonna give it a very light coat of anti-seize. So that way, when we remove it next time, hopefully, it should be an easy process. Make sure to not get any on the threads of the lugs. And then I've also got a thin layer of anti-seize on the inside mating surface of the rotor as well. And now we're gonna put the rotor back on. And you'll notice on the hub here, there are 2 threaded holes. These are for the factory screws to secure the rotor to the hub. And you want to align it so these 2 chamfer holes, one there and one right there, align with that. I personally don't like to put those screws back in because they have a tendency to rust and are very difficult to remove in the future. So we have those 2 screw holes lined up, and so we're gonna push the rotor back on. And if you ever get to this point right here, where this circle of the rotor gets stuck on the axle nut cover area, it's probably because either the coating or the tolerance of this circle is too tight on the rotor, so you'll just need to take a file and file that down a tiny bit so you can slide it on the rest of the way. After getting your rotor back on, if you decide that you want to put these little screws back in, I would highly recommend using some anti-seize on the threads of those couple bolts. Now we gotta reset the parking brake adjuster in there. And so what we gotta do is we gotta take our flathead screwdriver and we're going to turn it in an upward motion until the point that it locks and that we can't turn our rotor anymore. And now we're gonna go backwards down 8 clicks. After you've loosened it those 8 clicks, you should be able to turn your rotor with no problem. And then we can take our little rubber gasket here and we can put it back in the hole. Next, we're gonna clean the old silicone off the caliper slide pins, as well as out of the rubber boot and in the bracket here. And then we're also gonna clean up these brake pad retainers as well. We're gonna put silicone on the caliper slide pins because of this rubber component here, and then we're gonna put our ceramic brake lube on the retainers, since that is metal on metal. To clean out the boot, I like to just roll up a little piece of paper towel and run it through there, and same thing, I like to just roll it up and kind of put it on in there, clean out all that old silicone. To relubricate, I like to take a little bit of that 3M silicone paste, get some on the end of the caliper pin, just kind of work it on in the boot there a little bit, as well as take it and kind of run it through there just to kind of relubricate everything. And then I'll give it one last thin coat of silicone and I'll put everything together. Also take note that these pins are different. This one is completely round in my hand, whereas this other one has some flat edges to it. So make sure not to get those mixed up. So we've got our caliper slide pin relubed with silicone paste, and then we've got our retainers cleaned up for the most part, nice and shiny. And then we're gonna apply some of our ceramic lube to both of the retainers, and then we're gonna put the bracket back on the car. With those 2 bracket bolts in place, you can now torque them down to 41 foot-pounds. Next, we're gonna take some more of our ceramic lube and we're gonna lubricate the outside contact point that goes in the retainer. Not the face, you can still see the face is still black, just the outside part. And then the proper positioning for these is the pad with the wear indicator goes on the inside of the vehicle, and furthermore, for the rear rotor, it's gonna be in the downward position. So it's gonna go in just like that. As you're lubricating everything, you wanna make sure you don't get any on the surface of your rotor, and to double check that, just give it a quick little spin. So before we put our caliper back on, we just need to decompress that piston a little bit more. Since our new pads are so much thicker, we need to create a little bit more tolerance to slide it back on. So we're gonna take our big old wrench here, and we're gonna try and decompress this piston just a little bit more. There we go. And let's see if that's enough. Beautiful. And then we're just gonna have to probably push these caliper pins back in a little bit so I can maneuver it on the rest of the way. And now we gotta put the caliper bolts back in. And this is something I like to personally do. I like to put just a tiny bit of anti-seize on these bolts, mainly because I live in the Rust Belt and these can be really difficult to remove otherwise. Plus I work on my brakes pretty frequently just to keep everything lubricated. So I like to ensure that these are easy to remove when it is time to do that. Otherwise, you don't have to worry about this step. But then we'll put our pins back in place. Now it's time to tighten those bolts down. You can take your 17mm wrench and hold it over the threaded portion there if you need to hold that in place. And the torque spec for these rear bolts is 17 foot-pounds. However, I just like to tighten them by hand. Plus I've also got anti-seize on them, which can alter the torque specifications and potentially damage bolts. So I'm just gonna tighten this down by hand a little bit. And that should be good. And I'll just do the other one too. And that should be good enough. I've always done it like that and I've never had a problem. So now we're gonna move on to the front brakes. And I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly since it's pretty much the exact same procedure as the rears, other than the fact that there's no parking brake components to worry about. We're gonna remove the wheel, jack up the car, and put it on a jack stand. And then again, we're gonna come to the back here and we're gonna remove those 2 caliper pin bolts. And this time they are 14mm. And then we're gonna grab the caliper itself and we're just gonna give it a good couple heaves back to try and decompress that piston a little bit. And then we should be able to remove the caliper assembly. Almost there. There we go. I've got my jack already in place. Set it on there, and then we can remove the pads. And now we can take off this giant bracket here. And again, this also is held on by 2 big bolts in the back, one up top here and one on the bottom there, and this time they're a 17mm. And now it's time to work on removing this rotor. And so again, if you have those retaining screws in here, I would just recommend some penetrating fluid and then an impact screwdriver to remove them. And then we can do the same thing before. We've got these other 2 threaded holes here. We can take our M8 by 1.25 thread bolts and we can screw them on in here, and that'll help us pop off the rotor. However, the anti-seize did a really good job and it's already loose. I don't even need to do that. So we can take off our rotor. There we go. And we're already halfway done. All right, we're moving along pretty good. We got the caliper pin, the boot, and the caliper pin hole in the bracket here all cleaned out. We reapplied our silicone paste. Remember, silicone has to be used with any rubber components. And then we used our ceramic lube to lubricate our retaining points for the brake pads. And then we came over to the rotor. There was a little bit of rust on the inside rim here, so I just took a wire brush, cleaned that out, and then I took some brake cleaned the inside surface, mating surface here, and then reapplied some anti-seize. It's really good for rust prevention as well as preventing the rotor from sticking. And then same thing over here, just clean this up, applied a really thin coat of anti-seize. And before we put the rotor back on, we just want to ensure that these countersunk holes for those retaining screws are lined up with the threads on the hub here. And again, if you have problems sliding your rotor over this axle nut ring here, just take a file, just kind of shave away a thin layer so it can slide freely. And then if you choose to put these retaining screws back in, I would just highly recommend applying some anti-seize. And then we're gonna put our bracket back on. And in the process, try to prevent getting any of the ceramic paste or lubes on the surface of the rotor. And then we're gonna torque those 2 bracket bolts down to 80 foot-pounds. Now we can put the brake pads back on the car. We're also just gonna apply a thin layer of ceramic lube to this outer edge of the brake pad that makes contact with the retainers. I'm not lubricating the surface because I don't want any to get on the face of the rotor. And then we're gonna put this pad with the wear indicator on the inside with the wear indicator facing upward. We've got our pads back in, and in order to fit the caliper over new pads, which are thicker, you have to press back that piston again. And so we've got our big wrench, and we're just gonna decompress that piston until it fits over the new pads, and we'll put our caliper back on. And now it's time to put those 2 caliper bolts back in. And personally, I like to put a little dab of anti-seize on those bolts just because I live in the Rust Belt, and it makes it significantly easier to remove them. And the torque spec for these 14mm bolts is 36 foot-pounds. However, you really shouldn't torque bolts that have been lubricated. So I'd like to just tighten them by hand. Just give them a good little snug. And that's always been good enough for me. I've never had a problem with these bolts coming loose. And we have finished our front brake. We can put our wheel back on, torque those lug nuts down to 80 foot-pounds, and we are all finished with the assembly portion. So now we need to reset our calipers. And so before, when we took the calipers off and we took our wrench and we pushed that piston back in, if we go and push the brake pedal, we're not gonna have any brakes. So what we need to simply, and most importantly do, is just push the brake pedal a good 5 times or so. Until you can feel normal pressure again in the pedal. So that's good. Next, we need to ensure that our e-brake adjusters are properly set. And to do that, we're gonna push on our e-brake pedal with moderate pressure. And there should be between 2 and 4 clicks. So let's see what we get. We got right at 4 clicks, so we're like just on. Now, if you are out of that 2 to 4 click range, there is a micro adjuster located right here. So if you're within if you're at 1 click or maybe 5 clicks, you can tighten it to bring that number of clicks down, or you can loosen it to increase the number of clicks that you get in your pedal. If you're at, say, 6 or 7 or more clicks, then you're gonna need to do what's called a major readjustment, where you have to take off your wheels again and take your screwdriver and readjust those adjusters, and then give this a try again. You should be between 2 and 4 clicks. And now we're gonna talk about bedding in and breaking in the new pads. So specifically for the brake pads, there is no single answer how to break in these pads. It varies from one manufacturer to another. They all have their own little step. So I personally like these ProAct premium pads, and you'll see here on their website they say enhanced initial effectiveness, no break-in period required. You just put them on your car and you start driving. You don't have to worry about a thing. Let's compare that to a couple other brands though. How about these Brembo brake pads? These have a zinc coating on them, and you can see that you want to slowly develop heat, so under 30 miles an hour. You do not want to generate a lot of heat, they're saying. And so their process is to do at least 30 light braking applications, and you want to leave a solid half a mile in between each of those braking applications. So it sounds like a very slow, low heat lawn break-in process. How about centric brake pads? They too have different types of pads with different bedding in processes. They've got the street pads here, and they've also got their racing pads down here. Let's see what they have to say for their average street pads. Theirs is the complete opposite. They want to go from 60 miles an hour down to 10 miles per hour with high deceleration. They want you to generate a lot of heat. You don't want to brake so hard that you engage the ABS or lock up the brakes, but they want you to generate a lot of heat. And let's try just one more. How about these Hawk pads? See what they have to say. Bedding in Hawk pads. 6 to 10 stops from 30 to 35 miles an hour with moderate pressure. And then you want to make 2 to 3 hard stops from 40 to 45. So as you can see, every manufacturer's got their own process. There's no single answer on how to do this. Go to the manufacturer's website and follow what they have to say. I just like to get these Bono pads. Highly recommend. And lastly, for these parking brakes, regardless of if you replace just the rotors, just the pads, or both, you always need to do a break-in period for these pads. So now we need to bed in our new parking brake. And to do that, we're going to get up to 30 miles an hour. And then while we're driving, we're going to push our e-brake in one click. And then it's going to be held there for a quarter mile. And then we're going to let the e-brake off. So here we go. Okay, we're at 30 miles an hour. Now we're going to set our e-brake down one click. Okay, it's on one click. So now we're going to hold this for a quarter mile. So right now it's at a 6. We're at 0.7. We're at 0.8. We'll just hold it for maybe a couple more seconds for that additional 0.05. And we'll let off the e-brake. There we go. And now what we need to do is we need to drive for 5 minutes to let those drums cool off, because we just applied a lot of heat to them. We've driven at least for 5 minutes, and now we're going to do it one more time. Let's get up to 30 miles an hour. All right, we're at 30 miles an hour. Let's set our e-brake one click. There it is. And you can see below the gas gauge that our brake light is on, so we know that our e-brake is set at that one click. And so we're going to drive for a quarter mile. We're at 0.3. Holding it at 30 miles an hour, 0.4. And 0.5. Let's let off the e-brake again. And the brake light is off. And now we're going to go for another 5-minute plus drive just to cool off those drum brakes. And again, we've driven for at least 5 minutes. And now we just need to one last time ensure that we've got between that 2 and 4 click range on our e-brake pedal. So let's give it one more try. Yep, we're still at 4 clicks. And again, if you manage to get to 5 clicks or you're still not in range, you'll just play with this little micro adjuster until you have fixed it. And we are all finished. Good job, everybody. I just want to say thank you so much for watching. I hope this video could be informative to you and helping you change your brakes. Feel free to check out the description. I'll be leaving a bunch of additional information down there, torque specs, links to parts, timestamps to better navigate through the video and whatnot. Also, feel free to leave a comment or ask a question. I'm pretty good at getting back to people. So again, thanks for watching. Have a great day and take care.